some banks still making you pay prescribed debt? Now, the Banking Services Ombudsman has been receiving many complaints about credit providers misleading consumers into repaying debt that should have been written off because it's qualified as prescribed. Debts such as unsecured loans, vehicle loans and even credit cards can prescribe after a certain period of non-payment. Now, for more, we're joined by the Banking Services Ombudsman, Reana Steyn, who joins us virtually from Cape Town. Reana, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, in South Africa, the Prescription Act of 1969, read with Section 126B of the National Credit Act, stipulates that a debtor's liability to pay a specific debt to a creditor is extinguished as a result of the passing of a prescribed time period. Now, normally this kind of legalese makes us all want to go put our head in the sand. But even myself, when I read it, it sounded quite straightforward. How are banks or creditors misleading people in paying back these loans that they really shouldn't be anymore?
Good evening. So I think there's probably many answers for that, and I don't think there's just one answer of what happens in a specific case. So maybe the term misleading is not correct. So they either have a misconception. In their minds, there was an acknowledgement of debt. So we've seen those cases where the creditor, the bank, in our case, because remember, I can only talk about the banks. And I have no doubt that this also happens in other fields with other credit providers who are equally in breach of the National Credit Act. But I can only talk for the banks. So they think that there was an acknowledgement of debt. They've got some system note that there was an acknowledgement. The consumer or the customer comes to us and say, but they didn't acknowledge it. And then we go and we actually call for that call recording and we listen to it and we analyze it and we'll say, well, there was a discussion, but this wasn't an acknowledgement of debt. So therefore, in our view, it has prescribed. So that's one circumstance. There are others where I think there's just been a long-standing collection of the debt. And when we look at it, there was never payment. And therefore it has prescribed. And then one day, the customer kind of calls us and say, well, they should stop phoning me now because now it's prescribed. And then we raise that with the bank, and then they, sort of realize, okay, now it actually has prescribed. So what we're trying to just say is to consumers out there, they need to be aware of their rights, because if they're not aware of their rights, things can go wrong and they can end up paying a debt that has legally prescribed.
So if we want to get that message out there, what should people do if they want to find out if they are quite possibly sitting on paying back a debt that's actually prescribed? Is it the fine print in a contract? Where can they find out what they should be paying and what they should by rights not be paying anymore?
Okay, let me try and give a short explanation. But I think the other answer is if they're not sure, they'll have to maybe contact our office and actually log a complaint, because, without logging the complaint, I can't call for the bank to give me documents and look into the matter on that bank account. So once they log a complaint, and remember, it's free of charge, it will be a little bit of trouble to fill in a form, and that's it. And I can investigate what is going on. So it will prescribe if for a 3-year period you have not acknowledged the debt at all, phone call or otherwise, you've not made any payment, and there was no judgment taken. So just that's the basics. And then, of course, like any law, there's exceptions. There's provisos and exceptions. So 3-year period, no payment, somebody still wants me to pay, I think question that. Definitely start raising questions. Just another 2 things. Judgments, they do not prescribe after 3 years. So if you've got a judgment and you haven't been paying your judgment, that's a 30-year prescription period. And then the other one is, of course, your mortgage bond. Also not 3 years, but 30 years. So maybe you're financial trouble, you haven't been paying for a long time, but once it's a mortgage bond, it's a 30-year period, not the 3-year. But many other debts that, the typical debts that you get into for overdraft, a credit facility, personal loans, as you said earlier, motor finance, prescribes after 3 years. So certainly raise the question and come and ask. I think that's the best advice that we can give at this stage.
In your experience, looking at some of the cases of that you've been investigating in terms of the complaints you're getting, is the banking sector just pushing their luck here? And then when you do contact them, they say, oh no, you're right. This is actually a prescribed debt. We shouldn't be asking for the money, etc., etc. What seems to be the case here in terms of the banking sector's responsibility and acknowledgement of wrongdoing here?
Yeah, so I can honestly say that's not the impression we're getting, that they were trying their luck. They didn't realise. So in any case, there was a sort of a long-standing collection process going on, and only when somebody raises it and say, but hang on, this thing, the last payment was 4 years ago. Why are you still collecting them? They realise. So not the impression we're getting. And then the others, like I said earlier, there's actually a debate and a dispute. And although we've had a couple of hundred cases and we've recovered, say, over 1 million for consumers that the banks had to write off because the debts were prescribed, in 60% of the complaints we received, we did find in the bank's favour. In other words, it was not prescribed. When consumers raised it with us, we looked into it and we could prove to them that the debt, for whatever reason, had not prescribed. But there were those 30% of cases. And we just think that 30% of cases I see, and those are only the people who complain, know about my office and complain, it's sort of a reason enough to just put a warning out there to consumers. They do have rights and they should just be aware.
Now, we're often told that there is a massive issue in terms of banking as well as financial literacy in this country. And that's got nothing to do with people's general education levels. We're just not schooled in issues with what your rights are in terms of the bank, reading the fine print, and so the list goes on. How serious an issue is it when it comes to issues like this prescribed debt issue, that many South Africans just don't know what their rights are, they don't read the fine print, and they don't know that there are avenues that they can pursue if they want to speak to somebody who is a little bit more qualified to help them out?
Unfortunately, I think it is a huge problem. And exactly like you said, it's got nothing to do with your level of education. I mean, I speak to graduates who've got perfectly wonderful jobs in IT and all sorts of fields, but they've never heard of this. And of course, this is not going to be spelled out in your contract. So it's not going to be written in the fine print, for you to read, like, by the way, please warn us and tell us when we are collecting prescribed debt, from you. So that's not going to be written there. But just general financial education, whether it's how does a credit bureau work? You're going to be listed on the bureau if you don't pay your debts. All those things, it's not happening in our country. Many people have said for many years that it should start at school level already. Because by the time you talk to somebody who's finishing varsity and entering the job market, they may already have bad debts and are already listed on the credit bureau. So it should start earlier. I think many of us would be so happy if we could get that right in this country.
And then we're not just stuck trying to avoid certain phone calls coming at various times in our lives, so that we can say, listen, we listened to the lady on ENCA. She said, if I don't take your phone call and admit to anything, then I'm in the clear. Reana, that I am making light of a very serious issue. But if people are watching right now and they do want to get in contact with you and your team, how do they do that?
I think maybe the easiest would be to phone our call center. They've got very knowledgeable people there who can maybe quickly, immediately sort of assess whether this is a complaint that we should be logging. So 0860 800 900. Google us, Ombudsman for Banking Services South Africa. We've got a website. There's a form there. You can fill it in, click send, and we'll get your complaint. We've got an info inbox, info@OBSSA, for Ombudsman for Banking Services South Africa, .co.za. Send us an email. Ask your questions. We will get back to you. So many ways to get in contact with us. Our services are free of charge. We can certainly get you answers, documents, and some advice.
Okay, that sounds like we've really helped a few people watching tonight. We thank you so much for your time this evening. That's Reana Steyn, the Banking Services Ombudsman. That phone number 0860 800 900, or just find them online.